the house that watches. Mira had always been drawn to the old house at the edge of the forest. No one knew who had built it or why it was abandoned, but the stories were always the same. People who entered were never quite the same when they left, if they left at all. It was a dare, of course, that brought her there. Her friends laughed as they shoved a flashlight into her hands. "Just take something from inside and come back." "That's it, unless you're scared," they teased. Mira wasn't scared. At least that's what she told herself. The house loomed in front of her like a hungry animal, its broken windows like jagged teeth and the front door slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. She stepped inside. The air was thick, heavier than outside, and the faint smell of decay made her gag. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at it. The door slammed shut behind her and she froze. "Just the wind," she whispered, even though the night was eerily calm. She moved through the house, her footsteps muffled on the dusty wooden floor. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow dart across the hall. "Hello," she called out. Silence answered. The living room was worse. The furniture was covered in white sheets, but they bulged in strange ways, as if something was hiding beneath them. Her flashlight landed on an old mirror above the fireplace. It was cracked, but she could still see her reflection, or at least she thought it was her reflection. The girl in the mirror didn't move when she did. Mira's breath caught as the reflection tilted its head, studying her with wide, unblinking eyes. Then it smiled, a sharp, unnatural grin that didn't belong on her face. The mirror fogged over, and when it cleared, the room behind her was filled with people. Dozens of them. Pale, with hollow eyes and twisted grins, they stood in silence, watching her. She spun around. The room was empty. The flashlight flickered again, and this time it went out completely. "Mira," a voice whispered from the dark, long and drawn out as if tasting her name. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The sound of footsteps echoed around her, soft, slow, deliberate. A figure emerged from the shadows. It looked human, but its limbs were too long, its neck tilted at an impossible angle. Its face was smooth, featureless except for a single wide grin. The thing reached for her. She ran. Upstairs, down hallways that seemed to stretch forever, Mira ran until her legs burned. She burst into a small room and slammed the door shut. The whispers outside grew louder, joined by soft scratching sounds on the wood. In the corner of the room was a small child's bed, neatly made. On it lay a dusty teddy bear, its button eyes staring at her. She picked it up without thinking. The whispers stopped. The air grew colder. A low, guttural growl came from behind her. Slowly, she turned. The door was gone. Instead, the wall was covered in eyes, dozens of them, blinking and staring, their pupils following her every move. A deep voice rumbled, shaking the room. "You took what was ours." The teddy bear in her hands began to squirm. She dropped it, and it hit the floor with a sickening squelch, bleeding red as it grew sharp, clawed limbs. The walls closed in. The eyes blinked faster. The voice grew louder. Mira screamed. When her friends returned the next morning, they found the house empty, except for Mira's flashlight and a dusty teddy bear sitting on the floor. No one ever dared enter the house again. But sometimes, late at night, people swore they could hear a voice coming from the forest, whispering, "Come back, I'm still watching." It was a quiet autumn evening in the small, rural town of Cedar Creek, nestled deep in the heart of Pennsylvania. The locals had always kept to themselves, and the town's history was steeped in folklore, dark tales of the old mill, the surrounding forest, and the strange rituals once performed by a long-forgotten cult. When news broke of a series of disappearances, young people vanishing without a trace, many dismissed it as another town mystery. But when Carter and his friends went missing during the town's annual harvest festival, fear took hold. Carter had always been skeptical of the old legends, the whispers of the Order of the Endless Night. His friends had dared him to enter the abandoned church at the edge of town, where it was said the cult still gathered in secret. "No one's seen them for years," Carter had scoffed. "Just an old myth." But the truth was far worse. That evening, as darkness fell, Carter's friends waited at the festival, oblivious to the ritual unfolding in the church. Inside, the last remnants of the cult gathered. A handful of masked figures in black robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They chanted in a language older than the town itself, their voices rising in eerie harmony. Carter was at the center of it all. His body was bound, his mouth gagged, and his eyes wide with terror as the leader of the cult raised a dagger above him. The cult leader spoke in a voice that didn't seem entirely human. "Your blood will return us to the night that never ends." The dagger descended. Hours passed. The town was silent. The festival ended, but no one noticed Carter's absence at first. His friends wandered through the empty streets, calling out his name, but the church stood dark and forbidding at the edge of town. When the first search party arrived, they found the church in ruin, windows shattered, pews splintered, and an unnatural silence hanging in the air. Blood stained the altar, and the symbols carved into the stone glowed faintly, as if a shadowy power still lingered. But there was no sign of Carter, no body. The townspeople avoided the church after that, locking themselves away in their homes. Whispers grew louder, rumors of a cult that had never truly disappeared, one that had returned for their final ceremony. The next day, the disappearances continued. One by one, the town's youth vanished, their families left in a state of perpetual mourning. The cult no longer needed to hide, the town had become their stage. Weeks later, the entire town was consumed. Those left behind wandered through the streets, their faces hollow, their voices eerily muted. The darkness crept into their minds, whispering promises of eternal night. The cult's leader emerged once more, the only figure untouched by the madness. His eyes glowed red, his voice an unearthly chant that echoed through the streets. "The night will never end," he murmured, as the townspeople followed him into the abyss. In the months that followed, Cedar Creek disappeared from maps. Those who tried to enter the town reported hearing distant chants, the sound of children laughing, though no one was ever found. Only the legend remained, warning others never to venture near the dark corners of rural America where old darkness still ruled. The final ceremony had succeeded, and the town was lost forever. The room with no corners. It was a night like any other, or so Kara thought as she walked home from her late-night shift. The air was cold, the streets were empty, and the only sound was the soft tap of her shoes against the pavement. Halfway home, she noticed something odd, a flickering light in the window of a building she didn't recognize. It stood where an empty lot used to be, tall and shadowy with no signs of life except for that single pulsing glow. Curiosity got the better of her. It always did. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking open as if it had been waiting for her. She stepped inside, and the smell of damp wood and something faintly rotten filled her nose. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing. No answer. The flickering light came from the end of a narrow hallway. The walls seemed to press closer the further she walked, like the building was alive and breathing around her. She reached the source of the glow. An open doorway. Inside was a room like no other. The walls, ceiling and floor were perfectly smooth, made of a dark material that seemed to absorb light. There were no corners, just seamless curves that made her eyes hurt to follow. At the center of the room was a single chair, and on the chair sat a box, a simple wooden box with strange symbols carved into its surface. Something about the box felt wrong. As she stepped closer, the air grew colder. She could hear whispers, faint at first, but growing louder with every step. "Don't open it," they seemed to say. But Kara wasn't afraid of whispers. She reached out and lifted the lid. Inside was a single object, a small mirror. It was cracked, the shards reflecting her face at impossible angles. She picked it up and the whispers turned to screams. The door slammed shut behind her and the flickering light went out. Panic gripped her as she spun around, searching for an exit. The room felt endless now, the smooth walls stretching into darkness. Her reflection in the mirror moved, but not in sync with her. It smiled when she wasn't smiling. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The reflection's smile widened unnaturally, and it spoke in her voice, but deeper and distorted. "I am you, but better." Before she could react, the reflection's hand reached out of the mirror, grabbing her wrist with a cold, vice-like grip. She screamed as the thing began pulling her into the mirror, the cracks spreading like veins across the surface. Her body felt weightless as she was dragged inside. The last thing she saw before everything went black was her own reflection stepping out, adjusting its face and walking away. The next morning, Kara's co-workers noticed something was off about her. She smiled too much, her movements were jerky, and her eyes seemed hollow. "Are you okay?" one of them asked nervously. Kara tilted her head and grinned. "I've never felt better." But when she turned away, her shadow didn't follow. The vacation horror. It was supposed to be the perfect vacation. Sunny beaches, charming towns, and a break from the chaos of everyday life. Jake Thompson, an American tourist in Germany, had been looking forward to this trip for months, but the peaceful getaway quickly turned into a nightmare. It was a quiet evening when Jake decided to explore a small, off-the-map village in the Black Forest. The town had been recommended by locals, far from the typical tourist spots. The cobblestone streets were lined with timber-framed houses, each one older and more decrepit than the last. There was something off about the village, though Jake couldn't put his finger on it. As he wandered deeper into the village, the air grew colder, and a dense fog settled in. His phone had no signal, and the eerie silence was only broken by the occasional creak of a door or a distant ghostly whisper. "Just the wind," Jake muttered, trying to shake off the unease. He stumbled upon a small, forgotten graveyard hidden behind an ancient church. The gravestones were weathered and covered in moss, but what caught his attention was the fresh, unnerving sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the place. The whispers grew louder here. Suddenly a figure appeared from the fog, a woman, her face obscured by a long, tattered hood. She moved slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the damp ground. Jake's breath hitched. "Hello?" The woman didn't answer. She simply stood there, her figure illuminated by a flickering lantern that she clutched in her trembling hands. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. Her head tilted slightly, and for a moment Jake swore he saw her eyes, two dark, hollow voids where eyes should have been. She raised her hand, pointing to a gravestone behind him. The name carved into it sent chills down his spine. Anna Müller, 1893-1915. Beneath the name were symbols, ancient, forgotten symbols etched into the stone. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "Who was she?" he whispered. The woman slowly moved closer, her ragged clothes brushing against the stones. Her voice was barely audible, like a distant echo. She never left. Before Jake could react, the fog thickened, swallowing the graveyard whole. The whispers became screams, tearing through the night with an unnatural, bone-chilling intensity. Shadows slithered out of the darkness, twisted figures with hollow eyes and mouths too wide, laughing as they closed in on him. He ran, the village becoming a labyrinth of fog and nightmare. Every turn led him deeper into darkness, and no matter how fast he moved, the figures seemed to always be just a step behind. Suddenly, he burst into a narrow alley, too tight to turn back. The figures pressed in on him, whispering things too terrible to understand. One grabbed his arm, its touch cold as death. Jake screamed, thrashing wildly, until his back hit something solid, a door. Desperate, he yanked it open, stumbling into a room that smelled of decay and ash. The figures followed, their laughter echoing through the narrow space. Jake frantically searched the room, his flashlight flickering until it died completely. There, in the dim light, he saw her. A woman sitting in the corner, her face pale and broken, eyes hollow pits in her skull. She whispered something in a language Jake couldn't comprehend, but the message was clear. "You're one of us now." Before he could resist, the shadows consumed him. The next morning, hikers found Jake's camera on the edge of the forest. The footage was unsettling, just static until the very end. The last frame showed Jake, his eyes black as night, his mouth twisted into a wide, twisted grin, whispering something under his breath. She never left. The Shadows of Chernov Asylum. The Chernov Asylum, deep in the frost-bitten heart of Siberia, had been closed for decades. The official story was that it shut down due to lack of funding, but locals whispered darker tales of experiments, madness, and things that weren't quite human. Anton had heard the rumors his whole life, but they only fueled his fascination. As a paranormal investigator, he lived for the thrill of uncovering the truth behind the eerie legends. When a rare opportunity came to enter the asylum, he and his crew didn't hesitate. The building loomed in the distance, a black silhouette against the snowy wasteland. Its windows were shattered, its walls cracked and covered in frost. As they approached, the wind howled like a mournful cry, and Anton felt an unnatural chill run down his spine. "Let's set up in the main hall," Anton said, trying to keep his voice steady. Inside, the air was thick with decay. The asylum smelled of mildew, iron, and something sickly sweet, like rotting meat. The hallways were lined with rusted gurneys and crumbling walls covered in faded Soviet propaganda posters. "Creepy, but nothing out of the ordinary," said Yuri, one of the crew members. He laughed nervously as they began setting up their cameras. But then the noises started. It was faint at first, a low, wet, clicking sound that echoed through the hallways. It came from deep within the asylum, where the old treatment rooms were located. "What is that?" asked Nadia, the group's medic. "Probably an animal," Anton replied, though his gut told him otherwise. The clicking grew louder, accompanied by a dragging noise. Something heavy was moving through the halls. They decided to follow the sound, their flashlights casting long shadows on the cracked walls. The sound led them to the lower levels, where the asylum's experiments had supposedly taken place. The air grew colder, their breaths visible in the dim light. The clicking was now joined by faint whispers, incomprehensible but filled with malice. In one room they found rusted cages hanging from the ceiling. Inside each cage were bones, some human, others unidentifiable. Scratches covered the walls and floors as if something had tried desperately to escape, and then they saw it. At the far end of the hallway, illuminated by the flicker of a broken light, stood a creature. Its hunched frame was grotesquely twisted, its arms unnaturally long, ending in clawed hands that scraped against the floor. Its skin was grey and mottled, stretched too tightly over its bones. Its face was the worst, a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth, black, sunken eyes, and no nose, just two slits that flared as it sniffed the air. It moved toward them with a sickening, jerky motion, its claws clicking on the floor. "Run!" Anton shouted, but the hallway behind them was no longer there. Instead, it stretched endlessly into darkness. More creatures emerged from the shadows. Some crawled on all fours, their spines arched grotesquely. Others slithered, their bodies covered in pulsing, veiny growths. The air was filled with a cacophony of clicking, hissing, and guttural growls. Nadia screamed as one of the creatures lunged at her, its claws ripping into her shoulder. Anton pulled her away, but the creature tore off a chunk of her flesh, swallowing it whole with a wet, crunching noise. The crew scattered, running blindly through the asylum's endless maze of corridors. The creatures followed, their movements unnaturally fast despite their misshapen forms. Anton stumbled into a large room filled with rusted surgical equipment. In the center of the room was a table, and strapped to it was something still alive, or something that had once been alive. Its body was bloated and fused with machinery, wires snaking through its flesh. Its mouth opened, releasing a distorted metallic scream that echoed through the asylum. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind Anton. The creatures were inside with him now, their black eyes glinting in the dim light. "Please," he whispered, backing against the wall. The largest creature stepped forward, its maw opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. It leaned close, its breath hot and rancid, and spoke in a guttural, broken voice. "Stay, with us, forever." The last thing Anton saw was the creature's jaws closing around his face. Weeks later, a rescue team found the crew's equipment in the asylum. The footage showed only static until the very end. The final frame was of Anton, standing in the asylum's hallway. His eyes were black, his mouth twisted into an unnatural smile. Behind him, the shadows moved, filled with things too terrible to name.